In all 3 years of the lectionary, this fourth Sunday of Easter is called Good Shepherd Sunday. And in every of those Sundays, we read the 23rd Psalm, which probably a lot of you, knowing by your age, memorized that at some point in your life. Probably if I pointed to any one of you, you could recite it. Well, maybe not. But it's a favorite psalm. It's a psalm that's often used at funeral services because of the endearing quality of giving one's life over to the Good Shepherd. In each of those 3 Sundays, fourth Sundays of Easter, the gospel reading is taken from the 10th chapter of John. The 10th chapter, which begins with Jesus saying, "I am the gate to the sheepfold." And then it goes on into the text we had today, in which Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." Now there's a correlation between the gospel that we just heard and the epistle reading, or the Old Testament, I guess in this case, from Acts chapter 4. In both of these cases, Jesus and the disciples, and particularly the spokesperson, Peter, are responding to a situation of some duress. And the statements that come out are both a response to that. In the case of the first lesson from Acts chapter 4, the disciples, primarily John and Peter, have been arrested. And what we hear is Peter's defense before the whole council, the Sanhedrin. Now, just to refresh your memory, I think you know this, but maybe not. Acts is the companion book to the Gospel of Luke. And similarly to the Gospel of Luke, Acts tries to portray how the disciples pick up the baton. You know, it's passed on from one runner to the next, and how they continue the story after Jesus has been ascended. And by the way, the ascension, 40 days after Easter, is only recorded in the book of Acts. So that's where we get the whole ascension thing, 40 days after Easter, and then Pentecost follows after that. In the book of Acts, it begins with, in chapter 1, with finding some other person to take the place of the 12, because Judas is gone. And then it goes into chapter 2, the Pentecost event, which we will hear in just another few weeks. And then kind of a summary of the early church. And the early church continuing the ministry of Jesus. So in chapter 3, what happens? Anybody have a guess? In chapter 3, Peter and John are going to the temple. Jesus hung out in the temple in his last week, so they're going to the temple. And along the way, they meet this lame beggar at the gate. Remember that story? And the beggar, as beggars do, was hoping to get some money. And he says, you know, help me out. And they, Peter and John, look at him. And he expects they're going to reach in their pockets and give him some change. And Peter says, we don't have any money. But what we do have In the name of Jesus, stand up and walk. And that's what he does. Well, this is going to cause a stir, isn't it? It's not unlike the scene just a few weeks earlier when Jesus does the symbolic ritual of what's called the cleansing of the temple. When it causes a stir, because everybody notices something is happening. So here is this lame beggar standing up, walking, running, we're told, jumping. It doesn't usually happen that quickly if you've been lame since birth. But it happens in the story. And then Luke has Peter giving 3 major sermons right at the beginning. Now remember, Peter did not look at his smartphone to find out what was said. And the writer of Luke didn't have access to that. So it's his story of how the early church proclaimed the gospel. And you have to just go back and read these sermons of Peter to get a sense about what the early church found was most important. Of course, it was the death and resurrection of Jesus. So Peter preaches the sermon to the crowd. A crowd gathers. They're all listening, and we're told 3,000 people. Now, if you're leaders of the synagogue or of the temple, you get a little nervous about that. When big crowds assemble, because what does it do? It excites the Roman authorities who want to say a riot is about ready to happen. And they want to come swooping down at it. Well, the officials of the temple don't want that. So they arrest Peter and John, lock them up for the night. They don't charge them with anything. And then they have this council meeting on the next day. And so that's what you heard. It is Peter who, remember what happened to him just a few weeks before? What did he do? He denied Jesus 3 times that he even knew him. And if you want to read the language closely, it says he cussed and swore. So think of all your cussing language, and that's what Peter said. I don't have a clue who this guy is. And here is Peter standing up before the Sanhedrin, before the authorities, and proclaiming Jesus. It's a real transformation. So that's the context for this sermon from Peter. John, the writer of the Gospel of John, similarly has Jesus preaching a sermon. You could look at it that way. I am the gate, I am the good shepherd. Well, what was happening here? If you go back a couple chapters in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, Jesus is in the temple. Now remember, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is in the temple at least 3 times, so it's not a one-year cycle like the synoptics. And at the temple, some people bring somebody to him. Chapter 8, who did they bring? They brought the woman who was caught in adultery. They don't bring the guy, you know. It takes 2 people to do it. But they bring the woman, and they challenge Jesus. The law of Moses allowed us to stone some woman, not the guy, the woman who's caught in adultery. And what does Jesus do? Huh? Come on, you guys. He bends down and writes in the ground. We don't know what he's writing. They're waiting for an answer from him. And then what does he say?
He lives without sin.
Cast the first stone. And they all leave, we're told in a symbolic fashion, from the oldest to the youngest. They all leave. And they're gone. And Jesus says, where's your accusers? And they're gone. And Jesus says, go and sin no more. That's a pretty confrontational thing with the religious authorities. And then it continues on with this tension between Jesus and the religious authorities up until we get to chapter 10, which is the Good Shepherd. It's kind of the culmination of Jesus' sayings of I am. Chapter 11 is the coup de grace, if you wish, for Jesus, because it's the raising of Lazarus. That's what pushes the authorities beyond where they can countenance this Jesus and are ready to execute him. Now, going back to this Good Shepherd image, it's wonderful, isn't it? Jesus, the Good Shepherd, we're all nice little sheepy, we want to follow Jesus. But if you really think of sheep, they're really not such nice little things anyway. Especially if they haven't had their wool groomed off. It's pretty stinky after a winter of accumulating this wool. But we tend to always read this text externally. That is, Jesus, our shepherd, we are the dumb little sheep following behind. But I would like to suggest to you that you look at it more internally. One of the writers that I always find so inspiring is John Sanford, a Jungian analyst, theologian, and he has a book devoted to looking at the Gospel of John's stories from underneath. So if you look at this, the Good Shepherd is within us. And the Good Shepherd is the one that guides us in the midst of the ambiguities, the uncertainties, the temptations, if you wish, that we encounter in our daily life. And it's only if we align ourselves with the Good Shepherd, which requires our inner work, that's the only way we can continue this relationship, because it's all about relationship. If we do that, then we can cope with the stuff that comes at us. And by golly, this stuff is pretty negative, isn't it? In our life, in our world. And it's that stuff that happens to us that the inner guide, the shepherd inside, helps us to navigate. And we can only have that relationship with the inner guide if we do our work. That's why our inner work, whatever disciplines you have, are so important, so vital to us continuing to be the sheep, the followers of Jesus on the inside. We're not dumb. We're smart if we do that, because we have an alignment between ourselves and our inner guide. Amen.